Hi, this is Hiki with the Lost Samba podcast, bringing you an authentic experience of the best of Brazilian music online in the English language. This podcast is a continuation of the previous podcast, and the subject is what is considered one of the biggest shows on earth, by some the biggest show on earth, the Carnival Parade of Rio de Janeiro. It would be good if you watch the previous podcast, but it's not necessary. This is a standalone, although we do make a lot of references to what we spoke about in the previous podcast, so it's entirely up to you. We recommend it, but it's not necessary. After this introduction, we're going to show you a video of what is considered one of the best samba parades ever in Rio de Janeiro's Carnival. Not because of its luxury, of the technique, or the music, just because of the vibe. It has a very good vibe. The people are really loving it, and you see this in the video. And it's worthwhile seeing because it also covers a lot of what we talked in the previous podcast and what we're going to talk about in this podcast. Before we continue, I'd kindly like to ask you to put a like on this video if you obviously liked it, or if you like previous videos. It's a lot of work to do them, and it would be great if you would put a like. If you don't, you're also welcome to watch the videos, no problem whatsoever. And we hope you enjoy this week's podcast. Aquele abraço.
Estava dando uma lição. Ó praça hoje, ó praça hoje, tu és imortal. Reversos embalaram o samba. A sua poderosa triunfal. Tirou uma barriga, se fez uma cuíca, de outra barriga ao surdo. Olha meu império aí, uma marquês de sabuneiro, vambora! Divinas baianas do samba. Olha o reco, vamos juntos, hein? Divinas baianas do samba que faz passo a passo.
We've seen how the carnival came up. We've seen about the samba, but we haven't seen how the two intertwined. Carnival and samba. Nowadays, everybody relates the two, but it wasn't always like that. All of this began in the neighborhood of Estácio, which we have already spoken about in the podcast about Luis Melodia, who is from the Estácio. The link is up here. Guys who live there with the leadership of a very, very known sambista, Ismael Silva. They probably did samba during the carnival time, but they wanted to parade that music. They wanted to take samba into the carnival and do parades with it. So they came up with blocos, you could call it a rancho, you could call it a cordão, but with a group, a neighborhood group called the Deixa Falar. And this is considered the first proper escola de samba of Rio because it was a carnival group and it paraded the streets and it used samba. Two things that are important to see in this context are that samba was close to marginalized. You could still go to prison for going to a roda de samba, as going to a macumba session or a capoeira session. So that was one thing. The other thing is that the samba that the great public, or the majority of the people, listened to was a washed out version of Pelo Telefone. They didn't know what was the proper samba. Ismael Silva and his friends, they built up this thing together with the rest of the neighborhood, where they were going to parade with the samba. But for this to work, they came up with an innovation, actually two innovations. And these innovations were instrumental. So they took out all the other instruments that weren't percussion. So they took out all the wind instruments, the guitars, everything else, and they just kept the percussion. Then they added two percussion instruments. One is the surdo. That's like a bass drum, deep sounding bass drum. It's very physical. You're like, you hit it hard and it's very loud and everybody hears it. When you play it, you feel like the owner of the world because you're giving the rhythm for the rest of the batucada. It's like almost like playing bass in a rock band. So this was one instrument. And the other instrument that they put in was the cuíca, which is a squeaky instrument. And that was quite used in the 80s and in the 70s in jazz bands, even in disco bands, they use cuícas. The surdo was for the lower part of the body in these parades. The core moved to that rhythm, while the cuíca gave the dance for the rest of the body that's more loose. The beat of most Western music is in 4 beats. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm of the samba is like the heart. It's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And this is ideal for parades, and the surdo was giving that 1, 2, 1, 2. Samba, right, without any other instruments, and much more raw and perhaps much more African, much less middle class friendly and much more street friendly, was completely new. This coincided with the introduction of radios throughout the world and in Brazil. This heated up the recording industry or the musical industry, and there were many people recording sambas after the pelo telefone, and this spread throughout Brazil. And what happened during the carnival, there were the ranchos, which were very popular, and the cordões. Now, the ranchos were a bit too middle class for the poorer people, and the cordões, they descended into what was called the cordões de briga, which means brigas, fights. So one of the main things that they did was to pick fights. They would fight among themselves, they would fight with other cordões, or they would pick someone in the street and do a fight with them. So they were very violent, and no one wanted to have anything to do with them, especially the people from Estácio. They saw themselves seriously. They didn't want to be seen as a cordão de briga. They weren't also a rancho. They did samba. So they saw themselves in a mission to teach samba to the public, to bring the samba to the people. And this is why they called it an escola de samba, a school of samba, to teach people what samba was about and to hopefully drive them to have a healthy carnival instead of picking fights, and a more fun carnival instead of the ranchos. As you can imagine, the new samba brought to the streets, and this new concept of samba during carnival was a huge success. It's always good to bear in mind that this was a time where the opportunities or to enjoy yourself, or there wasn't much. There was a cinema here, something there, so anything that happened in the street attracted a lot of people. And Deixa Falar attracted a lot of people. Now, because of its success, other neighborhoods started imitating them. So soon there were escolas de samba in several different neighborhoods. Some of them survive until the current day as the biggest escolas de samba of Rio de Janeiro, namely the Mangueira and the Portela, which are rivals until these days, but they're friendly rivals. So there were these escolas de samba happening all over town, and there was a guy who came up with a great idea. Why don't we do a competition among these escolas de samba? The guy who came up with this idea is called Mário Filho. He is the person who gives the name of the Maracanã Stadium. The official name of the Maracanã Stadium is Estádio Mário Filho, and he is the guy who invented the parades of escolas de samba. The story is that he had this newspaper called O Mundo Esportivo, and they talked about sport. But sport in Brazil is basically football. Until it was like this then, it is like this now. There are other sports, but for Brazilian sport, or for the average Brazilian, sport is football. So when the summer came, the local championships and the national championships finished, so he had nothing to talk about. So he said, a championship among the escolas de samba. And he organized this, and his newspaper had something to talk, and it has a good circulation. So he brought people to this contest parade with the escolas de samba, and because escolas de samba was so popular, word of mouth, and the news spread, and there was this first parade of escolas de samba. Instead of being one escola de samba, several escolas de samba, and this is the origin of today's modern super parades. Now, the newspaper didn't last long. He went bust in a year, but his idea and his name are covered in glory, or in carnival glory, and in football glory. It didn't really matter that his newspaper went bust, because the next year another newspaper got it, then another newspaper got it, and then another one. Among them was O Globo, that is now the owner of the biggest TV station in Brazil and media empire. After a while, a mayor called Pedro Ernesto, who by a happy coincidence is the granddad of a good friend of mine, he saw that, well, this is a big event. We can't kind of keep it with newspapers. It can't be private, because one year newspaper may not want it and it'll finish, and it's better, and it's attracting a lot of tourists. So it's better under the care of the city council. And it was like this that the city council started to organize the parades of the escolas de samba. From these first parades, there are many things that continue until nowadays, like the idea of having a panel of judges that each of them gives a note to the different aspects of a samba school. Some aspects have disappeared, some other aspects remain until our days. So one is the idea of the samba schools kind of was called harmony, but it's the idea that the school got their theme together and they managed to pass whatever they wanted to pass well. The other aspect that they gave notes to was the drumming session, the bateria. There was one for the song. There was one for the costumes. There was one for the comissão de frente, and one for the porta-bandeira and the mestre-sala. One presence that's been a constant since the parade of the first escola de samba is the ala das baianas. Now, the baianas are probably a homage to Tia Ciata, but they're also a connection to the candomblé terreiros or the yards where they practice the afro-religion. And these are women all dressed in white, with beads and everything. It's very typical. They're normally women with a certain age that have passed the age to kind of show off their bodies and do their sexy moves. This is given note, it counts, so they have to be good. Despite, the modernization and the changes, the baianas have maintained themselves a constant throughout the history of the samba parades in Rio de Janeiro. Now we're talking about the late 20s, early 30s. So the parades were all in Chiasiata's home ground, the Praça 11, the birth of the samba, that neighborhood of bohemian, intellectual, ex-slave descendants, and that cultural mixture welcomed it. It had everything to do with that place. But then in the 1930s, there was a revolution, and in comes Getúlio Vargas. Now, Getúlio Vargas is a very complex leader. He's probably the most important leader Brazil has ever had, in several aspects, positive and negatives. But the important thing to bear in mind, at this point at least, is that he was a proper fascist. And he didn't end his career like that, but he began as a proper fascist. He considered for quite a while, and many of his close aides wanted him to ally with Hitler during the Second World War. And Brazil had the biggest Nazi party outside Germany at the time, bigger than the American one. Anyway, the idea of having a big neighborhood in Rio that was comprised of descendants of slaves who had their own strong culture, anarchists from Europe, Jews, didn't please him, as it didn't please his followers or his support base. So one of the first things he did was to knock down the Praça 11, and over it he passed an avenue that had the name of Avenida Presidente Vargas. Enough said. Despite this, right, he saw samba and his national success as an opportunity, as a tool to bring the country together around its culture, and he promoted the samba parades big time. Obviously, this came with a price. Samba parades became much more regimented. They began to look like proper military parades. The alas became more organized and like properly separated, regimented, and all the participants of a samba school had to wear the same colors, the colors of the school. Also, one thing that began being promoted were the floats, like these cars that were pushed. They couldn't be motorized, but the floats started to get better with the funding. The regulations also for the samba schools and became stricter. There was a set time for them to be parading. They lost points if they didn't regiment their parade, and this more and more distanced these parades from their African roots or from the favelas, and they became an instrument of fascist government. One thing that's very interesting that one has to keep in mind is that there was this underlying competition in these parades that was very strong, right? And this would be something that liberal economists or liberal thinkers would say, look, competition brings quality. But in the case of the samba schools, it's very true. If one samba school innovated in something, the next year the other school would imitate that, and then another one would come up with something, and if they improved in something, the other ones was also improved in the same thing. So it went on constantly raising the bar of quality, and obviously this attracted more and more and more people to watch it. You can accuse the Vargas dictatorship of creating this, but this fell well within the scholars de samba because raising the bar of quality showed them as capable, and it reverts to the Babylonian concept of carnival of reversal of roles. So in the 4 days of carnival or during that parade, they were really the kings of the town with their floats, with their costumes, with these incredible drummers, with the dancers. This is something that, as they say, the asphalt, like the people from the who were not from the favelas, they could never imitate them. So they really became, in a way, kings of the town. This regimentation and this search for excellence continued way after the Vargas dictatorship, and it continues to our days, right? They're all, if you go to a parade, you have people pushing you the whole time because everything has to be organized and the whole school has to be singing the same song at the same time. It goes completely against what people who are not Brazilian would think of the carnival as being something chaotic that people take to the streets and everybody goes crazy. No, it is taken very seriously by the people who are of the escola de samba. I went to an escola de samba, probably come back to this more times, but with a group of foreigners, right? I am Brazilian, but in my group there were some foreigners, and the guys decided to dance with one of the mulatas, and the guys beat him up because he's not supposed to do that. It makes the school look amateur, and they want professionalism, they want top performance, and nothing can go out of order. It is in a way legacy of this Vargas era. It is a popular culture, but it is an army that takes over Rio de Janeiro during the carnival with all its organization and power. So did I say that Getúlio Vargas was a Nazi? I'm just reiterating that. And there are lots of circumstantial evidences, apart from most of his cabinet being like proper Nazis. The period that goes from 1937 to 1942 is probably the one with the worst dictatorship ever in Brazil. Vargas police collaborated with the Gestapo. Jews were forbidden to come into the country. A lot of people were put in jail, tortured, and killed, some at point blank as soon as they got caught. He was indiscriminate in these prisons. It was anyone who opposed him, be it in the left, be it in the right, and it was like pretty bad. Brazil's biggest economic partner was Nazi Germany. And as a part of this, there was a broadcast, or several broadcasts, in the German Nazi propaganda films, mainly because there was a town or several towns founded by Germans in the southern part of Brazil, all of them very Nazi and pro-Hitler. Getúlio Vargas remained Hitler's friend until 1940. There's correspondence between them. But anyway, I'm saying all of this just to show the footage that comes now.
Im Morgenduft Kap Frio, Brasiliens Küste. Und nun der Zuckerhut, Wahrzeichen von Rio, Torwächter der Bucht von Guanabara.
The accent of the narrator saying Bahia de Guanabara, in my opinion, is very funny. In realistic terms, Getúlio Vargas is more of an opportunist. Before the war, he flirted with both the Americans and with the Germans. He would do statements praising one, he'd do statements praising the other, meet with one, meet with the other, do favors for both. So it was like this girl with two guys wanting her, and he played the game, getting the best of both sides, which makes sense. There's no sin in doing that. But gradually, the Americans, they made more interesting proposals to Brazil, and as they began to win the war, or as it began to seem that they were going to win the war, Getúlio Vargas definitely shifted to the side of the Americans, to the unhappiness of many of his ministers. As a consequence of this shift, the United States came up with a policy called the Good Neighbor policy. It wasn't only with Brazil, it was with Argentina, with Mexico and other Latin American countries to attract and make Brazil more palatable to the Americans and make the Brazilians feel more welcome in the United States and by the Allies. Part of this policy was a cultural exchange. So in the case of Brazil, three big things happened. One was Carmen Miranda. She was taken to the States under this pretense of creating friendship, and this really, really succeeded. She was a huge success in the United States.
Meu ganza faz tica-tica-bum, tica. Pra eu cantar o tica-tica-bum, tica. Uma canção do tica-tica-bum, tica.
She was one of the biggest money makers of her time. Then they also sent Walt Disney to Brazil to do an animation, and he did this animation with a Brazilian parrot. That in the States was called Carioca Joe, in Brazil Zé Carioca. But what interests us in terms of samba is that they sent Orson Welles to Rio to do a film. Now, Orson Welles, he went mad in Rio. He became a bohemian here. He went to live with a woman of the favela, was about to ask for divorce in the States, and he fell in love with the whole thing in Rio. And it was very problematic because he went over budget, and the studios didn't like what he sent. And he focused a lot on the Afro culture, on samba, and this was badly seen by Brazilians and by the big bosses of the American studios. And it was a big disaster for him in terms of his career and everything, because it ended very badly. They cut the money, told him to go back to the States, and from then on he passed from a situation of being like this genius who was going to change Hollywood and big filmmaker to be a problematic guy, a guy who didn't listen to the heads of studios, who went beyond budget, a difficult guy, and this stuck with him until the end of his career. But what interests us here is the wonderful images that he did of Rio and of samba. He found it very challenging. The equipment wasn't fit for purpose, but he managed to take these big shots. A lot of it is lost, but what is there is very good. Anyway, we hope you like this podcast. It's going to continue. I reckon it'll be 4 or 5 episodes. So there's a lot of samba waiting ahead. And I wish you a great week. Até mais. Grande abraço. Thank you for watching. I would like to thank Fábio Freitas, who I don't know personally. I've never met, never even sent an email to him, but he has a brilliant podcast about the history of samba, and without it, I would never have had the informations that I have. I'm going to leave the link below in the explanations of this podcast, and if you're curious to really go into detail, I recommend watching his podcast. And it's in Portuguese, but I guess with YouTube's technology, you can have subtitles in English or in whichever language you prefer.